we had the mayor last time who was talking a lot about neighborhoods. So I thought it was very appropriate to have my favorite organization, the Peaslee Neighborhood Center, and Jennifer Arens, who's the Director of Community Education, and Joele Newman, who is community organizer, to talk about their work, because they've been taking a real leadership role in terms of trying to get a more equitable situation for Cincinnati's neighborhoods, especially those neighborhoods that have been neglected or really impacted by major developments that have hurt the residents. So I've always loved this organization, but when they began blocking some developments here and over the Rhine and being effective in community organizing, I love them even more. And so it's such a pleasure having this forum today. And since this has suddenly become a hot topic at City Hall, partly because of your work, I think it's very appropriate that the neighborhoods begin to show their muscle and their ideas. And you, with your idea earlier that you put forward, you've worked with a lot of neighborhoods. So I'll turn it over to you all.
Yeah, well, thanks, Bill, and thanks, Christchurch, for having us and all of the people that are here. And so, as Bill mentioned, my name is Joele Newman, and I'm here with my colleague, Jen Arens. And we're kind of going to discuss some of the history and research that Peaslee has been doing regarding zoning, but specifically in thinking about the conversation that's happening at City Hall with proposed reforms, ensuring that the reforms that are being proposed are actually effective for the things that we're wanting and needing in our neighborhoods, and especially when we talk about equity, and specific to equity across race and class. And so that's kind of what our discussion will be about today, highlighting some of the national research, what we know. First, kind of starting with some broad information around like, why are we even talking about equity when we're talking about zoning? And then kind of going into some more specifics to hopefully bring a more equitable reality here to the city of Cincinnati. And so kind of the first question as far as why are we, again, talking about zoning when we talk about equity? And so our zoning policies, or our cities or municipality zoning policies, basically have the opportunity to either make it easier or make it more difficult for land use, for different land uses to happen in different areas. And so there's two main kind of reasons that are connected to why we're talking about equity when it comes to zoning. And so the first being an exclusionary history. So historically in our country, zoning policies and zoning implementations have mostly been designed in exclusionary way, mostly for the development of white suburbs. So mostly when we think of the history of the way zoning has been used in our country, it's been used to create large parcel of lands to have lots of sprawl and not to impact as far as like density, making it more difficult to develop housing at lower ranges that are affordable to people with low incomes or people living with low incomes. And so because of its exclusionary history, it's also impacted the segregation that's happened across our neighborhoods and across our different municipalities, specifically across race and class. So not only for exclusionary history, but also zoning can be connected to leverage. And so when we think about, or where other cities have been imagining what's possible with our public subsidies specifically, which zoning is like a public incentive and it's a public subsidy for the public's good. Many cities throughout the country have actually been leveraging or offering an exchange for zoning in order to bring a public benefit, most being realized by way of affordable units. So units that are income restricted for families living with low incomes. And so when we think about equity across race and class, and when we think about reforming our zoning code that has oftentimes like racist and classist implications, has segregated our city, segregated our neighborhoods, it's important to think about like, how can we use it in the future? And so not only the connection, but we also have kind of like the relationship. So mostly like the central question of like, what is the relationship? What role does zoning play in bringing more equity into our neighborhoods and into our city? And so a lot of when we talk about zoning in kind of today's time, or the zoning reforms being proposed for our city, it's connected to density. So again, thinking about density in relation to space in our land use, and how density can be leveraged for either profit in like private kind of market projects, or for equity in bringing like public benefit to in exchange for our public incentives. And so our kind of central question in regards to the relationship between equity and zoning is, how does the economic gain that happens from density for developers become a public asset or a public gain that contributes to equity across race and class? And so that's kind of going to be central to our conversation and our presentation throughout today.
Yeah, and I'm Jen. I'm going to jump in here. So we wanted to take time today, instead of saying like, hey, the city is proposing X, Y, and Z, just to like try to ground us in kind of the framework and the rationale for some of the reforms that the city's talking about, right? Where do they come from? How can we understand them? And how can we like properly interrogate them so that we know they're meaningful and that they're right? So I want to acknowledge that most of what's being talked about at City Hall in terms of zoning reform is what we could refer to as upzoning, right? So it generally means that we'd be changing zoning laws to allow for denser buildings to be put there, right? When you can build more revenue producing units into a building, you can make more money, right? You can build more economically. So again, like upzoning is generally what's being proposed. And I think certainly what I hear the most in terms of the frame, the rationale, the reason for doing this is framed that like these are equitable policies, right? Like if we upzone our city, we are going to get to more equitable neighborhoods. We're going to become a more equitable Cincinnati. And I want to interrogate some of those, some of the rationale behind that. So these are sort of the main three arguments, I think, for upzoning and the idea that it leads to equity. So one is this idea that it removes unjust barriers, right? So what Joelle was just talking about, that there are zoning laws that have been used in racist and classist ways, right? That is largely connected to like single family, very sparsely and not dense areas. So officials I've heard argue strongly that these changes are going to undo this like racist, classist stuff in our city. And I want to acknowledge that that is partly true, right? Without going into what's being proposed over how much of this is going to be touched, it's important to know that our city, the vast majority of our city is zoned for single family, right? That's not exactly a smart thing to do for an urban environment when 75% of your city is zoned for single family, right? There's a history of that preferences homeowners over renters. There's classism in that, there's racism in that, right? That we want kind of suburban feeling neighborhoods to be protected against denser, affordable housing, right? So there's a reality to that, and undoing that, right? So allowing for duplexes or triplexes or 4-unit buildings in some of those areas is on its face like a relatively good thing, right? Where we feel confident it can be sustained and it's like logistically possible. I recognize that like while that change does take us a step in the direction of equity, it's like really important to like examine what that impact is. So when you take away that barrier, right? So this is a barrier to building affordable housing, right? Taking away barriers are a good thing. I would say best case scenario in this single family upzoning case, right? That might open the door in new neighborhoods for affordable housing. And it might alleviate some of the more pointed inflation we saw, especially in the pandemic when everybody was looking for single family homes in Cincinnati, and that demand created a bit of a spike, right? But it's pretty specific to those issues, right? It's also important to acknowledge the limits, right? Like, so removing a barrier is a good thing, but that's not the same as making sure that affordable stuff gets built, right? So when you remove the barrier, generally speaking, what the market builds is the most profitable stuff, meaning it's the most expensive stuff, right? So we just have to acknowledge that even though that's a good thing, it's not a game changer for our city, right? Like we can take away that barrier and like what's going to get built, mostly still whatever the market renders, right? Whatever the market can get the most profit out of. So it's, and when we look at what our city desperately needs in terms of affordable housing units, right? Like everybody and their uncle wants to talk about the CBI numbers now, where it's like, we're 28,000 units short. Like we are 28,000 units short. Those units, that deficit is not spread across the income spectrum, as the city would like you to believe, right? It is very much concentrated at the bottom, right? So when we say we're building housing at all price points, sure, great. Like in general, does the world need housing at all price points? Yes. Does our city need subsidized units at all price points? heck no, we don't, right? That's not where our deficit is. So something like this won't solve that pointed problem. And then I just want to acknowledge too that at least from what I've heard, the scope of what's being proposed is not like we're going to do away with single family zoning like a city like Minneapolis did. It's narrowly focused to certain areas, right? So if we're really talking about undoing that racist classist history, I think it bears a broader conversation, right? A geographic conversation about like where and why are we keeping single family zoning? And then I also want to acknowledge that the first big push the city did for zoning reform last year didn't have single family on the table at all. And it was still being packaged as an anti-segregation tool, right? So when we're talking about upzoning areas that are already zoned for multifamily, like those are not laws that are racist or classist, right? So like undoing those laws is not doing this anti-segregation work. So we have to look meaningfully at like, why are we upzoning the multifamily stuff? What does it get us? Yeah. Yeah, sorry. I know I talk very, I know I talk very quickly. I apologize. I'll try to slow down. Okay, I think the most important thing I want to interrogate with you all today is this argument that upzoning creates affordable housing. I think it's really important that we ask ourselves to look at that very critically. So when you hear folks make this argument, for upzoning, often it's couched in this like, it's going to give us affordable housing, and the affordable housing is what's going to make us more equitable. There are kind of two ways that people explain this. One is this like, it's at least implied that it's going to directly bring us affordable housing, right? So I want to, and there are some other arguments about like, it will indirectly get us there, but it would definitely get us there. So I want to look at the direct argument, right? So often when you hear, when you've heard the case being made at the city last year and currently, right, there's this idea that like in a given development project, if we give that project extra density, bonus density, that project will build more cost effectively, right? They'll say, hey, this allows developers to build more affordably. And what does that do? It allows developers to charge lower rents. It will mean that the developer doesn't have these high costs, overburdened cost restrictions, and without those, then the rents will be lower. So this idea that like the developer gets savings and that those get passed on to a renter or a buyer. And I kind of think that like it's easy to miss the basic ridiculousness of that argument, but like right, that's not how the for-profit development world works, right? Like when you give a for-profit developer savings, it's not like, oh, great, I can charge, like that's not how rents are determined, right? So I just want to acknowledge, like in a for-profit system, right, like rents and sales prices are just based on like what the market bears, what that real estate market bears in terms of profits. So it's not like developers are like, oh, what are my costs? And if they're more or less in a given project, then I'm going to charge more or less on the back. Like, that's not how it works. They do it, it's the inverse, right? It's like, what can I get for these units? And then can I get the financing, and will it give me enough profit to justify the building, right? So like, I want to push back on this idea that like, that stuff just gets passed on. It doesn't, right? If a developer gets a really good deal on a piece of land or suddenly gets a bonus density, like that goes right into the profit margin, right? It's not like suddenly I'm charging less rents. I want to acknowledge that the exception to that rule is that we do have a handful of amazing developers that are committed to deeply affordable housing, right? Those few developers will use bonus density to help them offset those costs and keep their rents low. So organizations like Over the Rhine Community Housing, right? There's few of them. So, and we could certainly be giving these bonus density gifts to those developers without blanket changing the whole zoning system. And then just some of this stuff is, it's like a little like, now I'm not an economist, but I've done a lot of reading on this stuff. I also want to point out that like that gift to developers, that kind of bonus in revenue isn't really long-term, right? Like, because in land sales, like people who own land, who sell it to developers for development, right? They take into account, landowners take into account what developers can build there and how profitable it is, right? So if we upzone stuff and suddenly developers can build more profitable buildings, then like landowners just like up their asking price, right? Like there's some give and take in like how things adjust that that kind of capture that value, right? And I think what we want to focus on is like, how do you capture that value for the public good? How do you capture it for equity? Because this is one tool that allows us to do that when very few tools in the toolkit allow us to do that. So if we just cough it up without capturing it for the public good, then like it just gets captured by someone else, right? In this case, landowners, or in this case, developers. I know I'm still talking quickly, I apologize. And then the second argument is that like, okay, well, maybe it's not like that exact building incorporates affordable housing, but like, obviously basic economics 101, right? Like supply and demand. If we take away restrictions on building, then we get more stuff built. And when we get more housing built, it alleviates it, like it increases our housing supply, it alleviates some of that demand for housing, and that by nature lowers the cost of housing, right? So it's this like super simple kind of supply and demand take on that. Right, we know that expensive housing is more likely to get built than deeply affordable housing for obvious reasons. And the kind of, so then one question is like, okay, if what naturally gets built is expensive, how does that increase affordable housing, right? So folks who say that it does usually use this argument, this concept called filtering, right? So there's this idea that like, we're gonna make expensive, it's fine if the market makes more expensive housing, because whatever family moves into that new expensive unit is gonna vacate a unit that's like slightly more affordable. And then another family is going to move into that unit and vacate something that's slightly less affordable. So it's this idea that it just like trickles down the chain, that like households move and that eventually that creates affordable housing. So I think there are like, I want to push back on that in three main ways. I think that idea lacks evidence. I think it's a bad strategy for every city, but especially a city like Cincinnati. And I actually think there's just like real ethical, moral problems with that strategy for making affordable housing. I won't go too deeply into this, but like when you actually look at what economists who know stuff about the housing market say, right, is that like the housing market is really kind of like a set of sub-markets, right? Like housing's not like gasoline or toilet paper, right? Where it's just like, oh, the variation in cost is pretty different. If somebody gives me a better price, I can go over here and get that. You know, it's not like that. Housing is like intractable. It like dictates so much of our lives. People don't move quickly and easily from unit to unit to unit, creating this like windfall of change, right? Like that's not the economics of housing. Our friend Rick Jacobus, who came to do a Zoom training with Peaslee this past year, who's one of the nation's kind of foremost experts on housing policy, in an article he wrote that I would recommend in Shelter Forest, he talks about like, okay, yeah, housing's actually not Econ 101. It's like, it's advanced economics, right? Like that's not actually how it works. So it's not that we ignore economic rationales, it's that we don't use overly simplistic ones.
Yeah, if I could,
Please.
the other thing that strikes me is the city is a fixed unit with a finite amount of land. And the trickle down thing assumes that everybody who's buying a new unit is coming from inside the city. And everybody who's being forced out of an older unit for one reason or another, maybe it's because a new building's being built for their house, is going to have to stay in the city. And those are not true. And once you eliminate that, then the rest of it, with the other pieces that you've added, it falls apart. I don't know. I've never heard anybody give an example where a developer got a bonus, a for-profit developer got a bonus, and that resulted in affordable housing.
Right, yeah.
And I'm not even sure. Have you all done a comparison for what OTR housing or some of the other nonprofits are receiving in terms of bonus density compared with the subsidies that are going to the for-profit people?
Yeah, I've not done that direct comparison. I think I don't think they're very different, but I think how they're utilized is very different because you have obviously a mission-based nonprofit developer committed to affordable housing, and then a for-profit developer, right? And not to vilify whoever, it's just like the game is profit, right? If the game is profit, like we have to we have to make certain assumptions because we know them to be true. So I think like the research that does exist, there's no evidence that's like, look, this makes affordable housing. Like that doesn't exist. There are studies out there. Some of them are good, some of them are bad in terms of quality. But I will say there's nothing that says holistically like this is a good way to make affordable housing, that it happens. And also a lot of the studies do highlight that in particular places, like this can exacerbate gentrification. It can lead to increased housing costs, even if that's in the short term, even if it's in a specific area. Like those are real impacts that we can't ignore, right? So if we are not sure that it gets us to equity on housing in the long run and in the short run, it can actually exacerbate some of the negative side effects, then like, we might want to rethink it. And to that point, like this is our strategy, right? I want to first point out that strategies like this, generally the logic of them comes from like really strong market cities, right? Where it's like, there's this huge demand. The affordable housing crisis isn't just at the bottom, it's spread across because there's limited land, there's huge demand, everybody's clamoring for not enough units, and that causes spikes in housing costs, right? In those cities, arguably this is a better fit. I still don't think it's a good strategy, but doing something like this might alleviate some of the demand, but it doesn't create affordable housing, right? So I think for Cincinnati, that does not fit that description, right? We're like, we've got a lot of land, we got a lot of options for development. Our problem is that there's a particular kind of development that's happening in a rapid way, and there are whole other swaths of our city and whole other price points that aren't getting made at all. So I want to argue too that like, even if we think this filtering thing happens, it takes decades. It literally takes decades to filter down. Like, it's not like everybody ups and moves like in March and then in May. And then like, it's not real. It doesn't happen like that. And we are in an acute housing crisis, right? If this takes decades and the gain overall is negligible, then like, why is it our strategy, right? Like, why is that our strategy? And then I do think rightly people have criticized this approach as a trickle down economic approach. That's what it is, right? That is the that's sort of the game. And like in a world where we have much better tools, where we could be producing units actually at the price points we need, and we know that works, and we know that makes units, and we know it is a solution, then like, why this, right? Like, why this way like crazy loopy backward way of getting to an end that we could just be pursuing more directly? And then just lastly, I think like, I just think it's messed up. I think it's messed up to be like, oh, we're in this affordable housing crisis. And our plan for those of us who are at the bottom of the economic ladder is that like, eventually over the course of some years, the worst quality housing will be vacated for you to live in. And that's our plan for you. Like, I think that's really messed up, right? And that's not ever how it's framed, but when you follow the logic, that is the end result. And I think when the for-profit market has left whole swaths of our population behind, I think we're kidding ourselves if we think that market's coming back to bring us something good for those communities, right? Those swaths of the community have been deemed not profitable, so they're not valued in that economic system. Okay, I'm going to throw it back to Joel in 1 second. One last point. I think the third argument about how this leads to equity is that when we upzone, we're going to drive investment and development into new neighborhoods that aren't seeing it right now, right? That like by making development more profitable, suddenly it's going to go to all these places. So in Cincinnati, where it's like, oh, it's only happening in a few places, but if we upzone, it will happen all around, right? And I just think there's not any supportive evidence of that, right? So one thing it's important to note is that like we are already giving out this bonus density. We're just not blanket changing it. We give it out all the time in zoning variances that developers come request from the city. Developers come request those zoning variances from the city when there's profit to be made in them, right? So it's like, hey, this thing is of value to me. I'm going to go ask the city to make an exception, give me the extra density, and then it makes my project better, right? So I actually think that is the single best indicator, those projects, of what we can expect to see with these changes, right? And where, this is a bad, it's a bad graphic, it's very small. But this is the city's map of like the last, 5 or so years of where are these zoning variances being given. And it is overwhelmingly in over the Rhine. And the only neighborhoods, really the only areas that are seeing these zoning variances are the ones that are already deemed very profitable, right? So like we could make these changes all along our transit corridors and all of that, but it doesn't mean that developers, for-profit developers are suddenly going to go there, right? They're just going to make the most profit where the most profit is to be made, right? So it might, I would say maybe an argument is that it saves the city time on processing. I think that's like one actual legitimate argument for something like this, but it doesn't, these policies, when you change things in a blanket way and you don't treat different areas differently in terms of the incentives, they don't have the power to dictate patterns of investment. They just don't. Like, it's just not one, it's not a thing that they can do. It's an important thing to try to get, but it's not a thing that they can do. Okay, Joelle.
And so when we think about, like opportunities to do this better and make sure that it actually is done with an equitable reality, that's really where like Peaslee's like research came in. We were like, how is it possible that not only zoning, but other public incentives that our city is giving away to private market projects that aren't bringing community benefits could actually in turn be connected to community benefits. So our public goods are connected to community benefits or public benefits. And so that's when the development of Peaslee's equitable development rubric came from. It's been a community process pretty much for like the last 4 years, but we've always seen it on two paths. So knowing that our neighborhoods needed something tangible, like resources tangible in their hands, to know what like benefits looks like in a project that was being asked or asking the community of basically our collective assets. So resources on what is an actual like public benefit, what does that look like for our neighborhood? But then we've always had the end game kind of in mind of it being policy. So implemented not just on the backs of communities, but actual policy to where the city places requirements on developers that are seeking these public incentives to bring a public benefit. And so that's basically why we've been doing all of the research and advocacy related to inclusionary housing policy and connected to the rubric. And so when we talk about inclusionary housing, Peaslee's been talking about this a lot recently. It is like a national or a policy that's used nationally across various cities. And so cities look at, okay, these public benefits that are bringing a level of profit to private projects, how do we ensure that that profit isn't just pocketed by private developers? Again, how do we retain some of that for some of that public benefit for the community? How can we use it as leverage? And the good design of those type of policies takes like intentionality. So as Jen mentioned, the economics related to housing and development, we know isn't just like basic economics, it's more complicated than that and complex. But we know from those cities and the fact that there's over 700, I think, different programs that are in place across the country, the lessons kind of learn on like what makes an effective policy and what makes a policy ineffective. And so kind of connected to that, what we see and what cities have seen time and time again is that voluntary policies are ineffective. Anytime you just open up the opportunity for developers to potentially do affordable housing or again, see those benefits that the community wants, they never produce any units because they're not being required to produce any units. We can't just put like our good faith again in a market that has left and isolated entire communities based on profit. We can't just put our good faith in them that they're now going to turn around and kind of sprinkle in offer opportunities for equity. What we have found is that mandatory policies obviously are the most effective ones. So when you require a developer that if you're seeking this level of public benefit that's going to up your profit margin, that it not only you don't just get to keep the profit, but you have to give a public benefit in return. And so we mentioned Minneapolis earlier, but Minneapolis actually is a very great case study for the city of Cincinnati. They have pretty similar economics. And they've been through this process already. So Minneapolis had a voluntary policy for years, and they produced 0 affordable units from their voluntary policy. When they switched over and did some genuine reforms related to their zoning, so got away with single family zoning across their city bounds, along with a mandatory inclusionary housing policy in exchange for their public units. In 2 years' time, they had over 200 units of affordable housing. And so when we think about the place that Cincinnati is in, we have an opportunity with our current reforms or with our pathway to reforms to make sure that we're doing it right and we don't waste our time when we know that our deficit has already been there for years and continues to grow and is exacerbated even after the pandemic. And so the next kind of piece, or the level that Peaslee has been advocating for, again, with an effective inclusionary housing policy as a long game. The space that we think Cincinnati is in, and we've shared this, is in the space of an economic feasibility study. So knowing that the economics related to our public benefits and the profit that they bring to private projects, the fact that it's important that we have a sense of like, okay, where are we able to leverage, in what areas of the city and what markets are we able to leverage that there is a mandatory policy in exchange, that wherever the development is happening, it's mandatory that there's some type of public benefit recouped by ways of affordable housing units. And so this economic feasibility study is really the basis for all of the effective policies that we've seen throughout the country. Usually it's done by an equity-focused economic team, so Grounded Solutions Network, as well as Street Level Advisors, which is where Rick Jacobus is from, who did our series last year. But assessing, again, in an equitable way, and offering, in an economically smart way, not just reaching for the stars off of the first effort, but like really assessing from an economic perspective, what is possible with your public incentives, and what parts of your city are you able to leverage more out of your projects, and where should you set those requirements, because we know requirements are most effective. And so rather than just kind of like opening up the floodgates of upzoning or added density without any type of requirements, where we know we're not likely to see the economic or equity or the equity gains that we want to see, we've been advocating for a feasibility study to be done so that we can make our policy off of quality research and in economically in an equitably smart way. So I think that pretty much kind of concludes our slides. So we'd love to open it up for questions or thoughts or comments from other people, unless you have anything to add.
We do have a comment here in the chat. Peter Haynes says, the city's community conversations have used city games to have people gain an understanding of city building issues, but they don't mention affordable housing in their game. I think the city has dropped the idea that increased zoning will produce affordable housing. Any response?
Yeah, I mean, I want to be clear that like we are, right, Cincinnati is a mixed market. It's not like you could put, it's not like requirements across the entire city would render the same outcomes of affordable housing in every pocket of the city, right? Like there are hot zones in Cincinnati and there are not hot zones in Cincinnati. And we like, right, but like that's true for the other cities that have implemented this stuff too. So it's just a matter of like taking that into account, like where can you get it to move, right? So if all the zoning variances are happening in Over the Rhine, well, it sure seems to make sense to put some requirements on Over the Rhine, right? And if then, if and when other markets are turning, have turned, are getting hot, right? Like you expand, right? This Pittsburgh is an interesting example right now. Like Pittsburgh is like a tick behind Cincinnati in terms of economic strength and development. And they did an inclusionary policy that started just with one single neighborhood. And they've then expanded it into 3 neighborhoods. And there are other neighborhoods clamoring to be included in that scope. And their city planning department unanimously supports the expansion of this policy, right? Like it's smart. And are they making crazy amounts of affordable units? No, they're not, right? Because you got to do that via another channel, right? Like you got to make your deep affordable stuff with a robustly funded affordable housing trust fund. That's where you're going to make, that's your biggest stream if you do it right. But you can get an added stream by tethering it to market development, right? So you're talking about, generally speaking, these feasibility studies are done. They say you can set the requirements here. Cities are like hesitant. They're like, we don't want to take the market, and they water it down and they pass something watered down, right? That's generally how it works. But the other interesting thing to see is in those cities, in the years that follow, generally those cities ramp up those requirements. They make them stricter. They expand the geographic jurisdiction. And why? Because they work, because they make some units. So people can point to Pittsburgh and say like, oh, well, it's been a couple of years and they've only made 40 units. Well, it's 40 units at 50% AMI. And I know I'm going to talk about AMI jargon, but like that's a price point that Cincinnati for sure needs, right? That the private market does not produce on its own, right? Pittsburgh's got 40 units at that level. that got made just from this requirement, meaning they did not provide cash for it,
Mhm.
right? 40 units is more than what Cincinnati makes in a year with our federal dollars at that level, right? So we're talking about, we're talking about like multiplying our impact in terms of homes created and doing it just by smartly leveraging our resources instead of saying we're going to pay cash to everyone. This is a little bit of an offshoot, but I think one thing that's critical in this moment at the city, where we're talking about the trust fund and zoning at the same time, is that like the point is not to give cash to everybody to make any price point of affordable, right? Like the upper stretch of what HUD considers affordable for our region is not where our deficit is. So if we start giving cash to developers to do 80% AMI, like we are flushing our money down the toilet. Like that is cash that is very hard to come by. It is needed for the finance gap, the very big finance gap for the stuff we do need. And we need to be putting our cash there at the bottom and then trying to get some of this maybe 50, maybe 60% AMI streamed from wrenching some of these from an inclusionary policy, right? Like that would be a smart way to make our policies work in tandem. Instead, we're like, we're going to take the cash, we're going to drag it up here because this is what developers are willing to do. Right. And call it a day. And we're just going to upzone the city and say, like, we're going to have a much more equitable city on the other side. And I just don't think the theory pans out.
One thing that some cities have done is in lieu of manning units, they offer developers the option to put dollars into the housing trust fund. Any comments on that or any thoughts?
Yeah, we've like looked at that too. So usually, again, it's like effective when the cost of the on-site unit or the investment into the trust fund or whatever pot of money that holds for the affordable housing is more than the cost of the on-site unit. And so, that's kind of things that people or cities work out in the way that they develop their policy as far as like, are we going to require the units on site? Are we going to offer a payment in lieu of? How do we do that equitably to make sure that we're not just trying to continue to isolate certain neighborhoods or keep certain neighborhoods exclusive. And how are we going to make it worth our buck? So it's like, the average, I think it's probably adjusted recently, but like for an affordable unit, the number is oftentimes thrown out as like $100,000. If it costs for that unit to function at $100,000, like what would be the cost for the payment in lieu of? And so that way we can ensure that we have the funds, but also that the units actually get created. So
I think like one major mistake that cities have made across the city in past years is they set that opt-out too low.
yeah.
So it means that they don't actually generate any units. Everybody throws a little bit of cash into the thing that might generate some units, but it's just a question of design. Minneapolis that we just mentioned, their policy does allow a payment in lieu. They've in a couple of years banked more than $6 million into their trust fund, right? Like if you set it smartly and you make sure that it can generate at bare minimum as many units as the on-site requirement would, then you can consider it. For a given city, one piece of the consideration is how do you want it, whether or not or how much you want a policy like this to facilitate mixed income development in building, right? It's one of few tools that can do that. To the extent that a city really cares about that, it would push back on that opt-out. But cities have weighed those options. The key is to weigh them smartly and to say, like, what do we want out of this, right? And how can we get there? Yeah.
Okay, you have a question in chat. Mostly people can hear people talking here, but you might summarize the question. We're seeing at OTR Community Council that affordable housing often excludes parking. Wondering your thoughts on how park access connects to inequities in communities where parking becomes a high value amenity.
Yeah, parking's tricky, right? It's tricky. From a big picture level, like our city is overly dependent on automobiles, and that's a real challenge. And we need better investment in transit. And ideally, we don't want to have so much parking attached to all of our housing, because smart urban environments shift to better ways, more walkability and better public transit. So I think that's the backdrop that we should always keep in mind, or the big picture we need to keep in mind. That said, doing the affordable housing at the low price point that we need is very difficult, right? It's not to, like, when we do all this advocacy, it's not to like belittle or make it sound easier than it is. It's challenging. It costs a lot of money. The savings on parking, when you can reduce those parking minimums, they matter as a tool in the mix of things. I think they're an important tool to still be in the mix, especially when we know that folks under a certain income level are probably have like fewer vehicles to person ratio, right? Like those things should be taken into account when we're trying to facilitate or foster more affordable development. That said, like I get that in particular areas where parking is more of a concern or a quality of life issue, that neighborhoods might have stronger things to say or concerns about the parking stuff. I think it's tricky, right? Nobody likes parking lots, but I get it. Yeah, and it would be nice to just like do away with all the parking minimums. I get that it's not quite that simple, but.
Yeah.
One of the last things you guys talked about in your presentation was the feasibility study. How likely do you think it is that Cincinnati is like moving in that direction in any future?
Yeah, so Allison asked how likely we think it is that Cincinnati's moving towards that kind of feasibility study that we're advocating.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if we have like a sense as far as I would say it seems like the city really wants to make something move regarding the zoning currently. The feasibility study, when done right, takes about a year, maybe not even, yeah, about a year, costs about $40,000 to $50,000. So really not like literally a small drop in our city's bucket for budget. I don't know as far as how likely our city would be to move on that. I could see a possible path as far as like them passing the current upzoning the way that it is, and then coming back years later, like Jen said, usually what we see is like cities implement something, they see that it's not effective, then they come back and like try to redo it and make it stronger. So I could see a current implementation, something passing and not being effective, and then coming back and being like, okay, maybe we should do a study on this. Similarly, especially because there's zoning reforms regarding different incentives, so the tax abatements and things like that have been happening on the kind of residential side, that received a study. And so the fact that that same level of investment, a study being done on the larger incentives regarding zoning and tax abatements, I can see them coming back and doing that. We're continuing to advocate that happens before the actual policy is put in place, but we'll see if that happens.
I do just want to highlight like why it's important to do it up front, because
Yeah.
like if you give the leverage away now, you
Mhm.
cannot claim it back.
Yeah.
Right. So again, if we're changing public code that gives a bump in profitability, again, that gets captured by someone, right? You can't walk that back later, or it's much, much, much harder to walk that back later and say, oh, by the way, 10 years ago, we gave you that bump. We'd like to get some affordable housing out of that. That's not how it works. And again, the private market, the competitive market's already kind of worked that out. So it's written into, right? So it's like the way that developers say, I actually do need the tax abatement to make my numbers go. Why? Because I've assumed that I'm going to get it. And the people financing my project assume that I'm going to get it. So if you don't give it to me, my financing falls through, right? Like the market calibrates to what's possible, right? So when you change it up front, when you say, we're going to give you this bonus now, and from it, we're going to draw this much value. So it's a good deal for everybody. That's when it's possible, right? When you do it on the back end, you just can't do it on the back end. So that's why it's a mistake to offer that bonus density and multifamily stuff now. I think it should be carved out of the package that's on the table right now. We want to attack the single family stuff, like, or the the accessory dwelling unit. Sure, like we can do some of that now, because we're not going to be losing a huge opportunity to get affordable out of the denser stuff that's bigger scale. To the point of, to your question though, Allison, I think one key thing that we're up against is that ideologically, the feasibility study is at odds with what the city wants to be true, right? Which is that the problem is just a general market problem. And if we give more freedom to the general market, it's a very neoliberal, right? Like the private market's gonna resolve it for us. It's just not real unless you make it real, unless you put the parameters on it to make it real. So I've heard folks say that is to do that study, even to advocate to spending the money is too big an ideological battle right now, which I think that's a pretty crazy place to be, right? When we're talking about an assessment, an economic assessment based on reality, based on fact, based on all of the incentives we're already giving out, 15-year tax abatements, deals on public land, all of that stuff, to add it up to say, what's the actual value to a developer? What are the economics of development in our city? Where can we get a good deal in that? Like, that is the most common sense possible thing that people could be asking for, right? Like, it's not radical by any means, right? It's a very common sense way of being a public steward, or being in charge of public goods. So I don't buy that, but I think to get the city to concede that point is going to take a lot of loud residents. Like, we have to be demanding that stuff. Like, why are we passing this massive upzoning without actually interrogating what we could get from it? You know, like, we have to make that demand. So, yeah. Oh, yeah.
You all took a leadership role in creating the rubric, and which was a policy toward all neighborhoods having some power in terms of the development. Over the years, I think development has actually created a loss of affordable housing. If you look at overrun in terms of the gentrification, and we have a present situation in the West End going on. Have you seen any movement toward that kind of overall policy of discouraging developments that harm neighborhoods, besides just talk about zoning?
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if you want to kick it off.
I mean, I think people intuitively know, right? That it's like this thing that a lot of people are saying is good for us is not like, you don't need all the facts and figures necessarily to know. Like, yeah, I know people are being forced out, right? I know my neighbors aren't here anymore. Like, you can feel it. I think the problem is that when we have to fight that battle on a project by project basis, like, the people always lose, right? Because like the amount of time and energy it takes of, all volunteer leaders at the community council level to try to organize, to try to get it's capacity wise, it's not super sustainable. So I do think like it's why we need good policies. When projects are big enough, a project like the stadium, right? It's sometimes worth it, right? To try to put together a whole campaign to affect a different outcome or to influence a different outcome, but you can't do that for every parcel of everything. And in the meantime, they all go, right? So like, we need something big enough and wide enough to capture that equity piece more holistically. Because I think otherwise we are running ourselves ragged. Like, you could talk to most of the neighborhoods across Cincinnati are concerned about this stuff. And most feel like they don't have the tools to affect much change at the neighborhood level, right? So I think smart policy is a critical, is the piece we're missing,
When we were pushing the rubric forward for the city, the landsman alternative jumped into place. Has it had any impact, or has it been used at all? Do you have any experience or any report on that?
Yeah, so the question was, when we've been pushing for the rubric, that there was, at the time, Councilmember Landsman's priority analysis that also came into the picture and eventually passed into policy. As far as we know, that priorities analysis hasn't been used for any projects that have come through, as far as we know. When we were advocating for it, it also had very high standards for even when it would be kicked, like even when it would be applied. So the projects had to be at a certain level. I think it was $5 million for the priority analysis to even be applied. That was 2 years ago, I think, March of 2021 was when that was that policy was put into place. And we advocated that even if the city wasn't at a place then or now, we feel like really to put the requirements in, that the difference is collecting quality information. So seeing what's coming into the projects as far as like the rubric, and within itself, it's like a really, it's a pile of resources. So it's not just one tool, but in one of our kind of packages with the rubric, we have what's called a developer questionnaire, which really collects information regarding rents and subsidy seeking and all of this information. Just collect the information, even if we're not at the place of requirements. And the priorities analysis didn't really collect that information. It was more of a kind of checklist, if it like met or exceeded certain things. And yeah, as far as we know, it hasn't been applied to any projects, likely because of the high level of development that was needed in order for it to even be kicked in, like for it to be applied.
Was that gross level or is that city subsidy?
My understanding is that was city subsidy.
Yeah.
I'd have to go
I
back
have
and
to
double check the
recheck,
figures,
yeah.
but it was a pretty high threshold of city subsidy.
Yeah.
That would have triggered even its reporting.
Yeah.
How much, do you have any idea what, how much the equitable, estimate would be, I guess, the study?
The question was about how much the cost of the study, is that right? Or-
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
50 grand.
yeah, like $50,000. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, it's been said that would be a big hurdle, and everyone's like, it costs 50 grand, you know, I was like, oh, well, it would be an ideological hurdle. So I don't know, you know, and to be fair, like, when we're citing these cities that have done it, they've used grounded solutions, they've used Rick Jacobus to do it. Like, it's just like, that's their bread and butter. They are equity oriented, right? And they just know the economics well. They know how to, and again, it's not rocket science. It's tricky for those of us who aren't in the like housing development world, but it's not that. It's like run an example project, right? Run the economics in a hot market, run them a hot neighborhood, run them in a soft neighborhood, run them with these incentives, run them with those incentives, right? And it's a table. What they produce is a table of comparisons, and they do it with the help of developers in the cities where they do it, right? And they just look at like, oh, great. It means you could require 10% of the units to be affordable at or below 60 AMI, right? Or at or below 50 AMI, and you wouldn't be inhibiting development, right? So that's essentially what it tells you. It tells you the value of your incentives within the context of the costs for a development, right? So it's just a smart, simple way to show what's possible. I think it's a no-brainer. I don't know why we're not already, you know, I don't know why Pittsburgh is ahead of us. But
and I will say that the people who do the study have advocated is that the city be bought in. So we know that Cincinnati has lots of studies that have happened, like gauging our inequities, offering solutions, and what other cities have done. But what we see is a lot of times those studies are done, it's a big release on like, you know, we see the inequalities that are happening and there's all these recommendations, and then we don't have the policy gains. And why don't we have the policy gains? Because a lot of time the political will isn't there. So like, when grounded solutions or street level advisors have been most effective have been like when the cities have been bought in and be like, we're going to pay the $50,000 for you to come in. We're going to listen to your recommendations. Yeah, what usually happens is a little watered down, but we're going to put it into policy, and that like gives us as the starting point to like move it to make it a stronger policy.
We're reaching somewhat the end of our line. What would you add, telling some citizens how they can be helpful in terms of pushing this forward? What would your answer be?
yeah, I mean, we're gonna have there's gonna be a public, this is gonna be again kind of duped out in the public eye at City Hall as these you know, as these proposals take form into actual ordinances and legislation. I think using an equity lens and an equity framework to like interrogate some of the questions is really important. So I want folks to do their own digging and their own research, but mostly like, yeah, I think people should just like they did last year, show up and be heard on like, hey, this thing doesn't lead to equity. We could make it if we took these steps, right? So I think it's perfectly appropriate and right to demand that we do, you know, an inclusionary feasibility study before we decide to offer up bonus density in our already multifamily zoned areas. I think that would be a perfectly reasonable ask that would at least make sure that we had enough information to make the most of those zoning changes to get as much equity as possible, right? And to say, hey, let's carve that piece out until we can get there, you know? So I think that would be, yeah, I'd love to see that happen. I'll plan to do that advocacy myself, but yeah, I could use a few extra voices in the mix.
Sure. On the affordable housing, topic generally. Peaslee's been part of the coalition pushing the new initiative. So you're out collecting signatures on.
Yeah, we are. So you know, a lot of talking points at the city are kind of similar to our talking points. Like we know that there are a multi-pronged strategy, obviously, when we have almost 30,000 households that are struggling to find housing that they can afford. And so we know that it's not just the zoning piece that's going to make the difference. We know the funding, as Jen mentioned earlier, is the most central piece to how we can advance getting affordable units into our neighborhoods and our communities. And the funding and the resources is like the most thing that could impact as far as like watershed of like affordable units coming into our city. So we've been active in Cincinnati Action for Housing Now. We're currently collecting signatures here at Peaslee and doing different campaign efforts throughout the city. And so, yeah, we're proud endorsers and proud supporters of that campaign and effort as well.
And just to be clear on like the impact of that, right? We're talking about hundreds of housing units, homes being added annually, focused at where the deficit is, right? Like that would actually offset our deficit, right? That's something that the city's current plan doesn't come remotely close to touching. So it's a game changer and it's totally worth it, right? We'd be talking about ribbon cuttings every month for affordable housing that we desperately need, that would house families, right? That is a game changer that we need the most.
Any other final thoughts? Well, we'd like to thank Jennifer and Joelle for their leadership role in this whole effort. And we've got to promote them and go forward. Thank you very much.
Yeah.